I teach highly ambitious people who often fail to ask themselves whether they're taking enough risk early on in their career. If they're in a season now when they can't take on risks, could they do something more risky later on? And what would the world have to look like for them?
One of my favorite parts in talking to innovators is that their pathways are rarely linear. Jorge Torres is one of those innovators. Jorge has always been around innovation, but it's looked different in different stages of his career. He started out studying science at Yale, became a patent attorney, then a venture capitalist, aka a VC, and eventually found himself back at Yale teaching Venture Capital 101. There's a lot of good discussion in this episode. We talk about how people have affected every step of Jorge's journey, diversity of venture capital, and how impactful Jorge's teaching is. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Jorge Torres. You grew up in New York City, went to this little university called Yale and studied molecular biophysics and biochemistry, became a patent attorney after going to UPenn for law school, became a VC at Silas Capital, and while there, you became a Kaufman Fellow, and now to bring it full circle, you're now teaching Venture Capital 101 at Yale. Before you even stepped foot on campus, though, at Yale and all this, was there any early influences that really set you on this trajectory towards innovation work?
I always liked science, so I was the science nerd. And even though innovation is a broad term, it encompasses much more than science-based innovation. If you like science, you're someone who's going to be pretty keen on innovation and kind of well suited for that work. So I was just science was my favorite subject in school, and so going into college, even going to law school, I always wanted to sort of be around scientists, keep up with the latest advancements in biophysics, which was my thing in school. But when I was in law school, there was one formative experience. I got to, as part of my education, do some pro bono work with an entrepreneur named Ben Durant, who was starting a company and needed someone to help with his intellectual property strategy as part of a business plan that he entered into the first ever Wharton business plan competition. So Ben was a PhD scientist who was also doing an MBA at Wharton at the time, and we won. And I remember being at the competition, not unlike Startup Yale. This was now maybe over 20 years ago, and Ben went up to the stage to get the big check and invited me to come up and be part of the team, be recognized. And it was, really one of the sort of most gracious gestures anyone had ever made to me at that point in my career, and really formative because I got to see really what it was like to work in a team and to kind of work closely with an entrepreneur and have a very tangible success in a very short period of time. So even though I liked innovation, and I also went to law school and college, part of college during the sort of inflation of the dot-com bubble, and I also got to see it deflate. That's a interesting story we could get into, but sort of working with Ben and his team and being recognized and being included in that way really, really made me want to work with entrepreneurs more and more and be a part of what they're doing. So yeah, so that's kind of those were some formative experiences for me.
So you have these entrepreneurial experiences, and then you have the science background. So you're like, "Ooh, I need to tie these two together." Was that a thought process?
Yeah, so in college, I really wasn't entrepreneurial. I started a new student organization, but it was around science. It was called Undergraduate Science Symposia, and it was geared towards spotlighting the original research of students who claims an underrepresented identity in science. So we did two symposia, one around the science research of Black and Latino students, and then we did a second one that was all around women who were undergraduates and doing some really cutting edge research. So I started that group, but I really didn't connect the dots between my interest in science, my interest in law, innovation more broadly, until I was in law school. What helped me connect those dots was the frenzy that was going on, I would say 95 to 2001, at least for me. That's when my consciousness around kind of entrepreneurship started to be peaked, started to kind of open up. 95 was when Mark Andreessen released Netscape. I remember the first time using a web browser was in Phelps Hall on the fourth floor. And Yahoo was like the first site I visited. And then at that time, it was Yahoo was a portal. And the idea was you would give web users one place where they could access everything. So the web wasn't as fragmented as it is today, and you would just go, and it was like a directory. And if you wanted weather, you wanted stocks, you wanted news, it was all aggregated in one site. Seeing that and like learning more about the story, like it was a startup that did this, and then it got into trouble thanks to Microsoft and their integration of Internet Explorer into Windows. Following that saga all throughout college and then and mainly in law school, especially when the government brought an antitrust case against Microsoft. You know, seeing that, hearing about people dropping out of school and going to Silicon Valley, and in 6 months being multimillionaires. Like I didn't do that, but lots of people did during that time. People, some of whom I knew. Like that is when the dots started to connect, and sort of having that experience that I mentioned earlier with Ben and his team at the business plan competition at Penn, that kind of cemented this idea that I would, no matter what I did, I'd be involved in this work of helping innovators, helping entrepreneurs specifically move their ideas from the drawing board into the marketplace. And sort of that's been the consistent theme, in my career. And I've had many different jobs, but sort of being someone who supports innovation and entrepreneurship has been sort of the way that I've connected the dots for my career.
You mentioned like write the check. Is there been any other moments of like, ooh, like I'm gonna switch into this, or like how have you decided like, who actually I'm gonna shift the career a little bit? Like, what are maybe things you're looking at, or maybe key events that have like made you shift a little bit?
You're right. Like I've had these distinct careers where I was in college pretty much a scientist, then I was a lawyer, then I worked in venture, and then I worked in higher education. Um, Mostly, there's a different story to kind of explain each of those changes. From science to law, it was really about wanting not wanting to be a PhD scientist and kind of focus on one thing for 20 years, not knowing whether or not you're any good. Although that kind of comes back to rear its head in venture capital. I can talk about that in a second. But I just had many diverse interests that really would not have served me well if I had decided to go into academic science. And I met a patent attorney in my junior year of college who said, if you don't want to do academic science, you can use your STEM degree and go work as a patent attorney. It was an attorney named Gail Kempler at Regeneron who put that seed in my head. Ironically, I was doing a program one summer in my junior year, and she was invited to talk to all of us who were a cohort of underrepresented people in science. And the whole goal was to get us like to go into science. But she came in and like talked about being a patent attorney, and that kind of led me away from science. Uh, Not so good for that program, but very good for me because from that point on, I was pretty much focused in my latter half of my junior year and in my senior year of going to law school. Then I did that and I worked in law for about 8 years and kind of learned that I really didn't want to be my boss for the rest of my life. He had a great career, made a great living, Although he used to say there are a lot easier ways to make, the amount of money we make practicing law. And that always stuck with me. But what really kind of catalyzed my interest in VC was getting to work with entrepreneurs and investors as a lawyer. So at the firm that I was at, because entrepreneurs tend not to pay their bills, and because the VC work, at least at this firm, wasn't very plentiful, no one really wanted to work with entrepreneurs. No one really wanted to build relationship with investors as clients or otherwise. But people knew that I was interested in that work and that I was good at it. The last firm that I was a part of was a national firm. And so I'd get sort of business referred my way that nobody else wanted. And again, maybe bad for them, good for me, because I really enjoyed the work and over time developed relationships with entrepreneurs and investors that went from like client attorney to more personal, so professional and personal. And I got to learn more about what the investor clients did and got really interested in doing that. So my curiosity, coupled with my desire not to be a law firm partner for the rest of my life, kind of catalyzed the next transition, which was into VC. Now, the timing was terrible because it was end of 2010, early 2011 when I decided that I was going to leave the firm and pursue a role in venture capital. And at that time, unemployment was maybe 9.5%. We were still digging out of the crater of the Great Recession. And I think unemployment in VC was some multiple of the overall unemployment rate. And so if you had a job in VC, like you were holding on to it for dear life. If you were raising a fund, it was taking a long time just to raise, a nominal amount of capital. Very few firms were able to raise money at a reasonable clip during that time. So there weren't a whole lot of jobs. And so I created my first job in venture capital, which is the hardest job to get, your first in VC. And so the way I did that is I had a relationship with one of the firm's clients, Built New York, it's now called Built, and their CEO. Their CEO started that company, which is a consumer brand still around today, really forward thinking industrial design. And the company's CEO, Carter Weiss, and his team started this company in a couple of years, maybe 4 or 5 years, grew it to $35 million in top line revenue, $5 million in EBITDA, and like a million or $1.5 million of outside capital. So at the time that I was looking to get into VC, Carter was looking to leave Built and start the venture capital firm that he wished had existed when he was starting his company. So he had this really great vision of like partnering with businesses and their founders the right way to kind of align everyone's interests and grow together. And that idea was the genesis for Silas Capital. And I was talking to Carter around the time that I was looking to get into venture capital and telling him about how bad the market is. And he said, well, why don't you talk to my partner, Frank Lynn, and if you guys get along and, you think this could be something interesting, we'll bring you on board as the first outside hire on the investment team. That's what happened. I did that for about 7 years. In 2017, Trump had just been elected, and I had, by that point, 7-ish years in venture, and maybe sort of 14, 15 years working in law, and too many times in both industries being the only person of color around the table. The combination of Trump's election and just frustration at the lack of diversity in the VC industry kind of led me to seek opportunities where I could teach and kind of do something tangible to open up the funnel of talent that's flowing into the VC industry. And I was lucky enough to meet Hadia Mujid, who is the founder of an organization called HBCU VC, which is an organization that today is the largest provider of VC internships in the US, full stop. What is transformative about the work that it does is that the organization recruits HBCU students and alumni, affiliates, and creates these pathways through a venture capital fellowship that is held annually, creates these pathways into the venture capital industry for Black folks, Latino folks, and others who claim underrepresented identities in the venture capital industry. And so in 2018, 2019 timeframe, I started teaching with them. I had just started teaching at Yale as well, a VC seminar that I still teach today. And so that transition from being a VC to being a teacher was really motivated by a lot of frustration around who was around the table and has kind of led me to where I am now. Each transition had a different catalyst, I think, influenced very much by like what's going on in the world, but also my own curiosity, frustrations, and desire to kind of have a different impact than I would if I just stayed where I was.
Okay, time out. I want to just let you know that if you're looking to start your own venture, we have a free course at Station all about it. It'll help you get your foundation right with your own venture, especially if you're looking to be a bootstrapped venture. Again, it's completely free. Check it out in the description of this episode. Short timeout over. Back to the interview. One of the things that you mentioned throughout that entire part was there's all the relationships you've built, and working with you the last couple of years, it's really evident that you're so relational. So I'm not surprised that you're like, oh yeah, this relationship was the way you've built your career off of it. And that's something I really admire about you, because it's always like the person and I'm gonna care. And so kudos to you. I think that's a super cool way.
Thank
Just
you.
even the way you just describe it is incredible.
Yeah,
So
so you
yeah.
see, like at every transition, there's a key person, often more than one person, but definitely a key person who, like, had they not walked into the picture, there's just no way that I'm successfully making that switch.
You touched on, right, like, hey, I switched from being a venture capitalist to being in the education space to really help with diversity efforts, right? Because VC, even today, the metrics will tell you they're still horrific. Women getting less than what, a percent or 3%, something like that. How do you see that improving, like, or what are the things that you think are like key steps for improving that?
So if you just cut that question into pieces, the why are we here and how do we get out of this place part of it, right? Those two parts. So for the why are we here, you often may hear people say, well, there's a pipeline problem. They're just not enough qualified candidates for the number of roles that people of color or others who claim underrepresented identities could take, right? And I think the evidence is pretty clear that there are plenty of qualified candidates, especially at the sort of early career stages, but across the entire continuum of stages of sort of an investor's career. There are plenty of qualified candidates. In my view, what the evidence shows is that um, there's a structural problem, right? And this is well documented in the economics literature, the sociology literature. This problem of the monoculture in venture and in tech, the two are kind of not kind of, but are related, has been studied from multiple angles by people from multiple disciplines, and sort of the structural barriers to entry are well documented. It's a much longer conversation, like how do we get out of it? There are often two kind of competing ideas about how to make venture more diverse. These two kind of ideas are pitted against each other. I actually think we need both. The Since I started working with HBC VC, which is now, about 5 years ago, you see some of more awareness among limited partners in or commitment among limited partners to kind of make the face of venture capital look different.
The structural piece really, I think, clicked for me. I was talking to a good friend of mine, and he was saying, the math, right? Even if you write the structure, but he's like, yes, there's all these structures, right? The systematic racism, all these different things. But he's like, you just do the math, right? The venture math. He's like, yes, we can create, he creates a lot of these funds. And he's like, well, if the LPs, though, are just non diverse, he's like, all we're doing is the math still doesn't work. And they're, right, it's still very, like the LPs, right? If they're all just a bunch of old white guys, well, that's still not helping at the in the end game, like what we want to do for diversity, equity, inclusion stuff, right? Let's say, for example, right, you hired your investors, and the people maybe managing the funds are diverse, but the money they brought in is just a lot of like old white guy money. Is you still have to return money to those LPs or limited partners, as you mentioned, right? So at the end of the day, right, they're still winning at a high rate, but yes, and those people that manage those funds are winning, but like you mentioned, right, their flywheel is still really spinning, and like there's still a gap that's just still exists. So I think the way you mentioned, right, there's a structure, but it's also if people even just do the math of it, it's a math problem in some ways too.
Well, when I've heard sort of math invoked as a barrier to diversity and inclusion, it's typically in the context of an argument that goes, well, you know, we're not going to set aside capital just for Black and Latino or women or Black women or Latina GPs because, that is not, we're in the business, say the LPs, right? We're in the business of generating financial returns. And to do so, would we're not, social impact investing is fine. But our dollars are earmarked to GPs who can turn them into more dollars, not advance some kind of social agenda, not advance any kind of laudable social goal like diversity. As much as we would like to support diversity, we are driven by simple math, right? So Fred Wilson puts it, the job of a VC is to turn pennies into dollars, right? And so we're looking for GPs to turn of any color, right? Who can turn pennies into dollars, right? And so you can see that this is a flawed argument because it assumes that a GP who is a black man necessarily is not going to generate the same financial return that someone who is not, someone who's a white male. There's a study out of Stanford that shows that LPs have a really hard time when presented with track record of a black male led uh, general partnership. When they come to pitch, they have a time even kind of distinguishing between that team's track record and the track record of a team led by black males that doesn't have as good of a track record, right? So there's the cognitive, uh, both conscious and unconscious bias that plays into this. So when I hear math, that's kind of what I think about and what I'm reminded of in the context of diversity and inclusion efforts for the venture capital industry. And I think it's just flawed reasoning.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. The flawed reasoning of people like a lot of people be like, oh yeah, like these VCs, right? They have a tracker and whatnot. But if you really look at their backgrounds, a lot of times like, oh, they already had the network, or they already had the math. Like their personal math actually makes more like they are able to take more shots than someone who wasn't. So it's always an interesting. There's always a lot of reasons I feel like behind the math that people don't want to explain a lot, or it's like they don't want to dig into like why is it that case. And that's something I think that's been really open-minded, especially the last few years with, with the numbers being so dramatically different for people. I think that's been super interesting to me to see like what are the reasons behind all that math too.
Venture capital math is simple, right? It's not like we're putting satellites into orbit or anything. It's not rocket science. It really isn't. So anytime you hear math sort of raised as a reason why we can't be more inclusive of people who've been shut out of venture or shut out from tech. I'm immediately suspicious.
You've kind of hinted right at being very missional. So when you're done with this work, what do you hope the impact is? What do you hope to be able to say to yourself, like after you're done with your career, they're like, hey, here's the impact that I made throughout my entire career?
So there's a lot. I'm in the business of training investors or people who are going to be joining startups or starting startups. When it comes to the people, my former students who become investors, I hope that I'm sort of helping to make them better partners for entrepreneurs. There's a shortage of great partners for entrepreneurs who are investors, right? We need many, many more. So come join me in teaching venture capital. For joiners, like helping them really be better at doing the things that enable the success of startups, and helping them become big and impactful. And for those that become entrepreneurs, kind of understanding really how to be selective in who they choose to partner with, especially investors. So there's a very practical kind of legacy that I hope to have, which is, my students are sort of better partners for entrepreneurs. They are better enablers of that success happens that can happen with a startup, or better at understanding who to partner with. I teach young people, which is a real gift because I get to have impact. I teach highly ambitious, highly motivated, brilliant people who have lots of options, but often fail to ask themselves whether they're taking enough risk early on in their career. And, one of the things that I ask students to think about is whether there are areas where they could be a little bit more risk tolerant. Or if they're in a season now when they can't take on risk, could they do something more risky later on? And what would the world have to look like for them to do that? And so sometimes that means a student has a post graduation offer to join a bank or consulting firm. They take my class, they consider these things, and then they go and start a company. And that happens with every cohort of my class at Yale that I teach. That happens. But sometimes that means starting a startup 5 years after graduation and kind of having more of a vision for what entrepreneurship could look like after graduation, maybe not immediately after, but most of the time, what it looks like is a better sense of kind of the fact that, when you're 18 to 24, there are very few mistakes that you can make that you can't recover from. So think about sort of making more mistakes. And if you're not making mistakes, if everything lines up perfectly on your resume, then maybe you're not taking enough risks, and kind of whether, and that's most of my former students are not going to be VCs and they're not going to be entrepreneurs. But if they come through my classroom, I think they're going to have a better ability to kind of take calculated risks. For some of them, this is life changing. And I'll just say that to kind of boost myself up. They tell me, right? I never thought that I could create space in my life, either now or in the future, to take calculated risks. And I could have used the things that we talked about in class to kind of frame what those risks look like.
Well, I can safely say very confidently, actually, that your impact is super clear. And you're actually, I think, one of the most in demand people, I think, at where we work at Yale. You're right. You have the intensive, you have the course, and I'm always hearing like, yeah, Jorge said this, Jorge did this, Jorge did like it's a Jorge fest. I feel like once a week I at least get one student being like, yeah, Jorge did this or said this. So your impact is truly, I can confidently say it is there. I know you also teach a little bit outside of Yale. So where can maybe people learn more about maybe the work you're doing at Yale or even outside of Yale too? Where can people learn what you're working on?
JorgeTorres.com is the best place. to know.
All
Or you
right.
can follow me on LinkedIn too.
A big thank you to Jorge for having this conversation. I learned a lot and I hope you learned something too. Let me know what you thought of this episode by leaving a comment or signing up for the station newsletter in the description, and let me know what you thought of the episode there. Thanks for watching and listening.